So we look forward to the show today. Just a quick reminder, before we get into our show, Kathy and I are going to talk about COVID and how it's affecting our industry. We want to make sure that you understand that we are not representatives of the CDC or OSHA. These are not medical opinions or recommendations anyway. This show is specifically to address some fair housing questions that have come up. So we look forward to your participation in the show. And remember, our comments are recommendations and they are not legal advice. It's always good to confer with legal counsel. So thanks for being here today. Let's get into our show. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Fair Housing Insiders, episode number 4. I have Kathy Williams with me here today, and we are going to discuss a very important topic, somewhat sobering as well, but we're looking forward to this conversation and being able to assist all of our community on how fair housing relates to the global pandemic that's going on right now, but just in general, how do property management companies need to address infectious diseases and situations and scenarios like these? Where does fair housing apply? And, where doesn't it apply? Sometimes we try to merge them all together. So, Kathy, welcome to the show. We're looking forward to diving into this conversation.
Thanks, Jonathan. It's good to be here with you.
We appreciate all of you who are viewing this here today. And if you'd like to stay in tune with future episodes, make sure you hit that subscribe button and hit the notifications bar so that you can be made aware of all the future episodes that we're putting together for you. So let's dive into the conversation today, Kathy. So global pandemic, fair housing, and a lot of questions that we've had from our viewers about this and where it particularly applies. You and I started chatting about just overall the necessity of communication and how communication is so important. So what have you been talking to clients about? Where are some gaps that you think that property management companies need to pay attention to when it comes to communicating not only with their residents, but with their team?
To begin with, I think it's a really important time for all property management companies to be communicating with their residents on a regular basis. And that communication can occur through portals or through emails or through notices that are posted on the door. They certainly should not occur in person,
right.
With the social distancing guidelines that we're all trying to follow. Mm-hmm. But I think nonetheless, there is a responsibility to remind residents of what the housing provider is doing in this very difficult, unprecedented time to assist them with their safety and their security being in place in their apartment homes. Mm-hmm. So the housing provider should be explaining what they're doing that's unique and different and to meet these challenges. And then likewise, the housing provider should be communicating with its employees, reminding them of what the policies are for addressing residents, for performing work orders, for doing extra cleaning around the apartment community, so that just in case, and as an attorney, I always have to worry about what's going to happen 6 months or a year from now.
Right, yeah.
Someone accuses their landlord of not taking the appropriate steps that it should have to inform people, their residents and staff, and then to continually update that, because as we all know, looking back over the last couple of months, this has continued to change and grow, and our information needs to change and grow as we learn things. So that's the first and maybe one of the most important pieces of information that I'd like to share with everybody. Now, most of you hopefully are doing this,
Right.
but for any housing providers who are out there now who haven't been communicating in writing in a way that is recorded and documented for the future, I would suggest strongly that that begin immediately. And again, that it continues throughout the end of this crisis that we think of as the COVID-19 crisis.
Right, right. Yeah, good points. And I like how you emphasize too, like this is, we're going to see, just like we see in the news, there's a lot of potential economic repercussions for the housing industry. Even if we sort of go back to normal in another month or so, whenever that takes place, there's still going to be the challenges months to come. So that kind of, you said something a moment ago that kind of piqued my interest about how the important the communication is with residents. There's been a lot going on in social media, a lot of chatter about amenities and the common areas, things along that line, where it's in the lease potentially that they're available, but now because of COVID, the property management companies are having to lock those down. Does fair housing come into play with property management companies who are taking those steps to keep their residents safe because they are closing common areas? What's the communication involved in that? You feel like there's certain things that property management companies should or shouldn't be doing?
That's an area that I don't think is necessarily connected to a fair housing issue. That's more of a business call based on the governor's decisions to close down areas where people gather. And once that comes down from the governor of the state, I think it's up to each individual business owner, management company to implement those guidelines the best that they can under their limited authority. And I'm talking about the housing providers now. The housing providers have a lease, and that's their contract that governs everything that they do interacting with their residents. There aren't too many leases now that cover this kind of situation. So we have to go back to look at just a public health environment to decide whether a landlord has the right to close down common areas. And if a landlord does do that, do the residents then have the right to withhold some of their rent? I understand that's going on in some communities. Residents are intentionally cutting back on the rental payments because they don't believe that the normal amenities and services are being provided.
Right.
I do not think and again, I don't think this is a fair housing issue. I think this is just a landlord-tenant issue when it's all done and said. Those efforts to cut their own rent based on the fact that the landlord has locked down the swimming pool and the fitness facilities and the coffee shop, things like that. I don't think any resident is going to be found to have the right to cut back on their own rent based on that.
Right.
And the lease also doesn't give landlords much authority to enforce its rules when it comes to these kind of things. If the residents want to ignore them, and I've had a lot of clients contacting me saying, we've told the residents to social distance, we've told them they shouldn't be hanging out in the lobby or outside in the common areas, and if they do, they should social distance. Which is certainly the guidelines that everyone is giving all of us. And what if our residents don't follow those rules? What if they just choose to ignore them? Mm-hmm. Is that a lease violation? And it's probably not a lease violation. You know, in the leases in the future, under the new normal, we may have provisions about public health crises and rules to enforce public health safety.
Right, right.
But we don't really have that now. And so now it's more of an effort, I think, to warn people, to remind them, to advise them. There's not a lot of enforcement that I think certainly that can take place now. But even in the future, I doubt that you're going to be able to terminate somebody's lease because they absolutely refuse to follow the guidelines to stay distant from people and not gather in common areas.
Yeah, it's uncharted waters, I think, for everybody. You know, it's just one of those things you thought may happen, but we hope never would, and here we are today. And so
here we are.
Yeah, we're trying to you know, kind of regroup and sort things out and have good, you know, so property management companies who had a good communication policy, they're a little bit more prepared, and others may be trying to catch up. I guess one of the things that in my mind is an analogy, you know, because I've been seeing the same thing, Kathy, a lot of concern from management companies about, well, I don't want to pay my rent because I can't use, like you said, can't use the fitness room and I can't use the pool and so on and so forth. Well, it's really no different than, you know, how far is it going to go depending on where you live? Well, I don't want to pay my property taxes because I know my property taxes go to road fixes.
And schools are closed. So
I'm not going to pay my property taxes, or it's not going to work. Now, again, you may not be able to use that analogy on your residence, but to me, it's like a decent, you know, parallel of, you know, how you may want to think of the reasons behind why you have certain policies, which kind of leads into, you mentioned earlier about people who are now, of course, there's so many people out of work. And there have been reports of the dramatic decrease in how many people were able to pay rent. And we know that's just going to be an ongoing item. So that goes back to maybe not today's lease, but maybe a future lease. Questions that have come in: if property management start accepting partial payments or things along that line, is that a fair housing situation or a potential violation or a potential headache that someone's creating if they make allowances for late rent and partial payments? What are your thoughts on that, Kathy?
I think that we're in a situation now where landlords and housing providers should certainly consider taking late rent and using rent payback or payment programs for residents who have been negatively impacted, and it has reduced, in some cases, completely eliminated their income. Right. And that is going to go on for a while. Now, hopefully that will correct itself in a couple of months, but for people who don't have savings, that certainly could impact their ability to pay the rent this month or next month. Now, fair housing could be involved with this because unfortunately, a lot of people think, and understandably so, I'm not criticizing this belief, that they have to be consistent 100% of the time. And if they're not, that's a fair housing violation. And that is not necessarily accurate. Oh, the reality is, it's a fair housing violation if you treat someone different than your usual policy, and the reason you do it is because of their protected category, their race, their religion, their national origin, their disability. In this case, it would be, I think, a good business decision. Now, I think it's an individual business decision. It's not made by the government or anyone else. It's a business by business choice, whether to adopt a policy that explains that because of the pandemic, the COVID-19 crisis, whatever you want to call it, we are going to be making exceptions to our usual rules about rental payments, about doing workout rental payment plans, about who we renew at the end of their lease and
Right.
why.
Right.
Even about screening decisions that are made in the future. All of those things could be an exception made for people because they were negatively impacted by this pandemic.
Right. Right. That's good. That touches on a lot, because often it's like, well, this is our policy, and that, from my perspective, being in public relations and in marketing, that's a PR nightmare if anyone was just to say, well, that's just our policy. Nobody wants to hear that right now. Everybody needs some comfort in some way. And it's wonderful to see our industry as a whole just rising to the occasion and doing all that they can to help residents and create ways for them to be able to continue their way of life and have a home. So that I like the thought that you mentioned even about what's coming as far as policies. Like, so for instance, most of the time in a policy, if you're late on your rent, well, that means automatically you can't renew. So that's like one of a few different things that need to be addressed sooner than later, and look for ways to, in your new leases, so that those items are being covered. So those who were affected by COVID, it's not going to come up, 6 months, 10 months from now, whenever their lease renews, and that addendum, that adjustment has been made, right?
That's right. And it isn't that big a deal to create a policy like this. And what that policy would mean is, just because you worked with someone now or over the next couple of months because of their employment or financial situation being dramatically changed because of the pandemic, that you can work with someone like that, but that doesn't mean you have to permit all your residents to be late on their rent 6 months from now, because you permitted someone today to be late on their rent because they were negatively impacted by the pandemic. So the policy can be written according to the fact that it applies to people who have some documentation. Now, you can't require the usual level of documentation that I think all housing providers are used to requiring, but some documentation that a person has been negatively impacted. And once that occurs, that person will be considered for exceptions to policies such as you were late on your rent for 2 months in a row back in the spring because you were negatively impacted by COVID-19. Therefore, we're not going to use that against you when we decide whether to renew your lease 6 months from now. That would be an exception. It would apply only to people who had documentation that they were negatively impacted, and wouldn't have to change your policies forever for everyone in the future. So it can be done. It can be done in a way that discourages fair housing allegations. Like, well, you gave my neighbor an exception to your policy. You renewed his lease, even though he was a couple of months late on rent. But now you won't do it for me. It must be because of my race. Well, no, it's because that was a situation in which we were addressing that resident being negatively impacted by the pandemic. Today, the pandemic is not going on. There's nothing in your situation to show that that exception applies to you, and therefore our normal policy applies, which is you got to pay your rent, you got to pay it the full amount and each month and on a timely basis.
Yeah, beautiful. I like that. So I guess the fair housing takeaway is, again, I think we talked about it earlier. There's got to be some way to make adjustments in your policies, show that you have that communication protocol, show that you're making adjustments based on unique circumstances. And so that goes to not only clear communication, so everybody knows what's available to them, but then also written documentation for the particular residence where you did have to make those adjustments for, those addendums, those ways for them to be able to, maybe pay their rent in partial payments and things along that line. So is that a good summary? Whether you're on site or whether you're in corporate, that would be the fair housing takeaway. Good communication and good documentation.
Exactly. I can't think of better advice to give anybody. And I think along the communication lines, I think it's really important that companies communicate with their staff about these potential policies that they're considering. What we don't want is residents calling their leasing office, talking to the staff, and being shut down, so that in a very stressful time, like we're all living through now, we add the stress by saying, well, no, we aren't going to let you be late on your rent. We never do that. That's against our lease.
Yeah.
And so we just are not even going to think about doing that. Now, technically from a, strict contract basis, some companies could take that position. Now, you know that if people don't pay their rent now, it depends on what state you're in, but most states have a moratorium on terminations for non-payment of rent. So I don't think you're going to, even if your staff is taking that tough stance when they're communicating with residents, you're not going to be able to do anything about it, at least in most states. So my view would be, let's be as supportive and as cooperative as we can with your residents, rather than taking the hard stance that you usually take, that you're usually justified in taking. I think we all have to have a little bit of more flexible, more supportive way of communicating with your residents and trying to work with the problems that they are facing, so that hopefully they'll continue to be good residents 3 months from now. Even though it might be a struggle between now and then, they'll stay with you. They'll feel forever in your debt that you worked with them cooperatively during this very horrible time.
Yeah, it's bridging the transactional part of our business with the human part of our business. There's nothing more dear to everyone's hearts than their home, for the most part. So, and again, it's amazing to see our industry. And I know, Kathy, you read the same forums and articles and a lot of discussion with our clients. And overall, it's been amazing to see what our industry has been doing to rise to the occasion. And
yes, I think that is very true. I think as difficult as this is for all of us, we're all amazed when we look around and see the wonderful things that are happening. And it brings out the best in people and companies in a time like this. Now, unfortunately, it also in individuals, it brings out stress and frustration, sometimes can bring about the worst. So I know some of our housing provider community are struggling with very difficult residents who are behaving badly, who are not cooperating. I guess, to tell you the truth, that's something they all have to deal with, and we know they do every day anyway.
Right.
But I always say that those individuals shouldn't govern how we behave and our attitudes.
Right.
And I would hope that during this time you're all doing what you can to alleviate your stress so that you're not taking that out on the residents who certainly probably don't deserve it and who right now need your understanding.
Yeah. Well said. Well said. Awesome. So segue now. Let's take it to another level of sensitivity, I think is probably a good expression. So the management becomes aware of a resident who does have COVID. And now they're concerned about others getting it, and they're concerned about what they have to clean and things along that line. What's fair? Does fair housing have anything to do with this particular situation? Any legal obligations or items that management, site staff, corporate need to consider if they become aware of a resident who has COVID or any other infectious disease for that matter?
My answer on this is actually the same as it would have been 3 or 4 months ago when I was being asked about what happens when, for instance, a property manager becomes aware that a resident has an infectious disease. And as we all know, COVID-19 is just the latest infectious disease. There are so many of them out there.
Yeah.
And how does a housing provider protect its employees who are expected many times to go into the unit and perform work, and the person in that unit has an infectious disease? And now we're talking about this particular infectious disease. My answer is, number one, I think it is absolutely a terrible idea to ever disclose to other residents or to staff that a person has a particular infectious disease.
Right.
I think the only precautions or the best precaution is to assume that residents have infectious diseases, because many of them do, and you never know it. So the fact that you might know John in apartment 100 has COVID-19, that doesn't mean you don't know that Mary in apartment 115 has tuberculosis or has AIDS or has any one of so many infectious diseases. So the answer is to gear your employees for or to protect them by the gear they wear when they enter any apartment.
Okay.
One of the maybe really odd things about COVID-19 is many of us have it and are carrying it, but don't know it because we didn't get sick, or we got sick in a minor way and we just passed it off as something else and we kept going. But unfortunately, that meant during that whole period of time, we were out there sharing it with everyone around us, which is the whole idea of social distancing. So when it comes to other residents, do they have a right to know that someone in their apartment community has tested positive or is being quarantined or has symptoms? I think it's okay for property management to, for instance, in a notice, say that you should be aware that there are people that live in this community who have the illness or probably have the illness. unfortunately, with this illness, it takes so long between testing and the determination that, again, unfortunately, a lot of people have been out there passing it around until they actually get the testing results, which can be 2 weeks later. So we should not have confidence in interacting with the residents, should not have confidence in interacting with other residents, that those residents don't have it, might have it tomorrow,
Right.
maybe had it yesterday. We should just assume everybody has it and act accordingly. So I think the information that should be given to residents is, there probably are people in this community who have it, and please act accordingly. We are doing our due diligence in cleaning multiple times a day, especially in areas where people might have touched surfaces. We're doing everything we can, and we are assuming that there are probably people in this community that have it. We recommend you behave in the same manner.
Right.
There is no legal obligation to inform people in a community that if you believe someone has it, there is absolutely no legal obligation to inform people of that. And you should never inform people about a particular resident's identity if you think they have it or if they've told you they have it. Doing that is, now we do get into some fair housing problems. That is not only a terrible violation of confidentiality,
Right.
it easily could result in that resident being harassed and intimidated, threatened by other staff people and their neighbors. So that is just that is something that should never be done and could turn out to be a fair housing violation. Maybe not today, but maybe in the future.
Right. Yeah, that's good. And you know what? Something you touched on earlier, Kathy. There's all kinds of memes going out there right now about just washing your hands, like as if this was some, like a revelation of some sort. In some ways, COVID has just created more of an awareness of best practices that, as companies, property management companies, whatever business we're in, should already kind of be in place, not only to protect our team, but protect our residents too. Getting it down to the basics of personal protective equipment and what OSHA requires. And that's another whole new topic, of course, but just some of those basic practices that probably should have been in place anyway, because like you said, there's all kinds of diseases that are out there. You have no idea what you're putting your team in. So good things to keep in mind. And I like too how you mentioned just, obviously we're not governed by HIPAA, but we would never, ever, want to let our own personal fears jeopardize the well-being of our residents. And one slip of the tongue can create so many problems for that poor resident who's facing that. And of course, the domino effect that will come with it. That'll affect the company, the community itself. And we're trying to avoid that. There's so much stress that's out there right now. We have to do our part to minimize that, as best that we can. So one other thing that was on my mind, Kathy, just because we have a lot of people who listen to the show and in our community overall, different housing sectors. So there's a little bit of a difference, obviously, between senior housing and multifamily, single family, student housing. Any quick little points that you would like to mention that maybe senior housing needs to think about that's a little bit more relevant to them than perhaps multifamily? Anything along that line?
I think there is a difference. One of the differences is this illness certainly has a much more drastic impact on seniors. So I think operators of senior housing should take that into consideration when they are deciding what their actions should be about sanitation and cleaning and upkeep. And again, communication with their staff and residents. Usually senior housing is in a different structure than a multifamily property, than a non-senior multifamily property.
Okay.
A lot of times it's just one single building.
Right.
And because of that, it's easier to control entrance and exits.
Right.
It's easier to prevent vendors that normally come in and out of the building, to shut that down. And that may be an excellent idea for senior housing. And again, maybe taking much more strict steps with your safety protocols that are being initiated. It makes more sense in senior housing, and it's easier to enforce.
Right.
I have a lot of clients who operate senior housing and who have informed their residents that if they choose to go visit their relatives during this time, that when they get back, they will be expected to lock themselves down in quarantine for 2 weeks. That they are not going to be welcome to be out and about in the building if they have chosen to go out and mix with other people in close circumstances. So while I think it's almost impossible for an apartment management company to do that in a typical apartment condition, I think it's fine to take much more serious steps. We're back to how to enforce those steps, maybe. And again, as I said, it's almost impossible to enforce it, but I think more communication, more warning, more advice, more referral back to the CDC guidelines, I think is a really good idea for senior communities.
Right. Good. Yeah, little nuances depending on what housing sector, and a lot of our clients in our community, they cross over. They're mixed different parts of their portfolio cross over to those different housing sectors. So some good thoughts, good takeaways. So, wow, what a big topic, sobering topic, one that's for all of us. It's dear to our hearts from the perspective of like, what can we do? What can we do to make our residents' life better? And at the same time, make sure that we're being fair housing compliant. So lots of takeaways from today: documentation, communication, and training, of course, talking to your team about it. So Kathy, thank you so much for your perspectives, your insight. And we want to thank everyone who's watched this video. We appreciate you. Take a moment to subscribe to our channel. And as well, share this with your team, your colleagues. There's a share button available, and please subscribe. So thank you for being here on the show. We appreciate you being here.
And good luck to all of you. We share our thinking about you during this difficult time.
Absolutely. So stay tuned for our next episode. Take care, everyone.